Virginia Woolf said that Shakespeare was a mirror, and that whoever went to Shakespeare, they would find themselves in the texts. I'm not in any way suggesting that you personally are a tyrant, but in what sense is the book a mirror to the world at the moment? And what led you to write the book?
It is actually, as you suggest, Stuart, it is amazing and even hard to understand how Shakespeare managed to create this mirror effect. That is to say, it really has been the case for 400 years now that people have looked at Shakespeare and have seen themselves. And that is true now as well. Of course, you see differences as well. But first and foremost, it's as if you're opening a letter and the letter is written to you and it has your name on it. But you'd think it couldn't possibly have your name on it. He's been dead for a long time. But it does have your name on it. And that effect, and I think it's actually, in some sense, the deepest effect of Shakespeare is that the texts themselves have evolved. They've evolved to meet the moments that we live in. And I think that was actually, in a curious way, part of Shakespeare's business model. I think he understood that it was better to write that way rather than to write in a kind of tight and controlled way where only your immediate audience would understand what you're up to. Back in 1987, so a long time ago, I was invited to give the keynote at something called the Shakespeare Tage, the Shakespeare Days in Weimar, which was in the German Democratic Republic in East Germany, the communist part of Germany. And I went, and it was a very unforgettable, really unforgettable experience. First of all, I checked into, they put me up in a wonderful, famous old hotel called the Elephant Hotel from the 18th century. And when I went to the desk to check in, the desk clerk said that because I was the keynote speaker, they were going to give me the best room in the hotel. It was Hitler's favorite room, they said. There was a balcony, and the crowd would gather under the balcony and chant, Liebe Führer, komm heraus aus dem Elefantenhaus. In German, that means, dear Führer, come out of the elephant house. It was a kind of Mel Brooks, how cute you are, you little Führer joke. And I said that I'd rather not stay in that room. And the clerk expressed surprise. Anyway, there are many aspects of this visit that were unsettling, but the most remarkable moment came when there was a student production of Hamlet. And the student production was no better than student productions usually are, but it was good. And it understood that Hamlet is a play about students studying abroad. Hamlet is in Wittenberg, Horatio is in Wittenberg, Laertes is in Paris, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are his friends, all studying abroad. And they're coming back to Denmark for the funeral, for the marriage. And there's a scene in the play in which Laertes asks to go back, asks permission from the king, the tyrant, or the murderer, as we know, to go back to Paris, because the marriage is taking place. And the king asks Laertes, does he have his father's permission? And his father, Polonius, says, yes, he has my permission. And then in this production, the actor who was playing the king went to a desk, he opened a drawer, he took out an East German passport, he stamped it, and he gave it to Laertes to go to Paris. And the entire audience gasped. So I looked around in the darkness, and everyone has very, very flat, no one is expressing anything. Everyone has very, even though I heard the sound, everyone has very neutral faces. And I realized, of course, that not just that, of course, this was a political gesture, that this was a moment at which people were being shot for trying to cross the border to go to France. And it was a student production and it was tremendously charged. But I also realized that that's what Shakespeare has been since 1600. That's how it works. It's always worked that way. It's always had a kind of political relationship it's always been thinking about tyranny and freedom. And that I was just seeing a version here and now of what the plays are about and how Shakespeare wrote the plays. And that was at least as much behind why I wanted to write this book as the election of the miserable Donald Trump.
Why is Shakespeare still so relevant?
I mean, Shakespeare understood something maybe in the most profound way of any modern writer since the ancient world, since the world of Homer and Sophocles. He understood that art has the capacity to stay alive by evolving. He actually understood, in a curious way, the principle of evolution. And the principle of evolution is that you don't fix the meanings of things. You make it possible, as it's possible in biology, after all, to mutate, to change, to adapt to the circumstances, to grow a longer beak if you need to pick out the seeds from a flower where you have to have a longer beak to get them. The plays do that. Shakespeare was a genius, not a genius of the way we think in romantic poetry, of genius of pure invention, but a genius of adaptation, a genius of figuring out, as he figured out with virtually everything he wrote, how to use what was already floating about and how to seize upon it, how to transform it, how to trust randomness, how to trust surprise, how to use the constraints within which he operated as an artist, how to grasp the place of chance and not simply of intelligent design. He couldn't have anticipated. Academics like me write as if he read everything and thought of everything. That's no way he could have done that. But he created structures that evolve, that adapt to changing circumstances. And his genius is the genius at allowing for mutation. And that's why he's still alive. That's why we care about him, about an artist who was able to create modifications from common origins. The origins were not his own. He moves things about. And he had the kind of weird understanding that things like uppity women, gay men, Jews, blacks would be interesting to think about in his own time. And then they turn out to be interesting things to think about for the next 400 years.
I understand that you've done some work on new phrases and words that appear in Shakespeare for the first time. Can you talk to me a bit about that, about Shakespeare as a crafter of words?
Shakespeare was a kind of word-obsessed person. Clearly, he must have been a little bit like James Joyce. It must have been in his blood, as it were. It's hard to think that you could actually get there without just having it in your system from the beginning. So this is clearly someone who is obsessed with language, obsessed with puns. As you probably know, in the 18th century, Samuel Johnson was a great Shakespearean, a great admirer of Shakespeare, but said that the pun was the fatal Cleopatra for Shakespeare, for which he was willing to give up the world, think it was well lost. And it's true that it's as if he's someone who can't help himself from hearing words bump against each other and playing with each other. So one thing to say, to qualify or complicate what we both, I think, agree on, which is that Shakespeare is not remarkable for invention, but for use, for recycling, for remaking of what was coming his way, is that he does something bizarre with the English language. He has a gigantic vocabulary, unimaginably large, and it's a vocabulary that is also filled with words that haven't been used, at least in print, before. So we were talking about this in preparation for this conversation, Stuart, that if you actually look to see the number of words that are, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, are used for the first time in Shakespeare, you get flooded with a crazy number of words, even in single plays like Hamlet, which has dozens and dozens and dozens of words used in print for the first time. And then the question is, how could the audience have understood what was being said? Why didn't it sound like gobbledygook? And part of the answer is that Shakespeare tends to be very clever about defining what he's doing. When he uses a word like assassinate, which he used for the first time in Macbeth, if the assassination he uses says, or if he uses the word like incarnadine, he tends to define it immediately. So that's part of his technique. But part of the technique is also he just combines words that hadn't been combined before. We talked about unpregnant. Unpregnant of my cause, says Hamlet. Unpregnant? That's the first time that has ever been used. There aren't that many people who walk around unpregnant. But Shakespeare had that idea of being able to combine the un and the pregnant. And there's tons of it like that. And you get it. You get it.
Part of the fun of being at a writers' festival and having questions coming in electronically is we get a few curveballs. Here's one. Please give us your thoughts on the idea of Shakespeare as the equivalent of today's The Simpsons, as in being able to talk to a broad audience about what other people can't say.
I love that question, actually. First of all, I love The Simpsons. I'm completely with that questioner on that. And I do think that Shakespeare shares with The Simpsons a tremendous love of recycling junk. And The Simpsons is brilliant at that kind of clever, sardonic, disturbing recycling of wasted materials. I think Shakespeare, I adore The Simpsons, but I think Shakespeare finds a way of breaking out of the satirical and ironic mode of The Simpsons and finding deeper places to go. Not that The Simpsons doesn't have its moments of depth, it does. But I think that the questioner is quite right, that The Simpsons, there's something Shakespearean about the geniuses, it's probably teams of people who write those Simpsons episodes.